Hello everyone and welcome. Yes, my name is Arafire and welcome to a special episode. Now, combiners have been all the talk recently, with discussions on Transformers the Show, Rohan's Corner and Borders Do putting out some very good choices of their top 5 combiners. I have actually already done this video quite some time ago, which you can check out above my head here. But what I want to do today is combiner related, something I wanted to do for a little while, couldn't quite work out how to fit it in. But I think I've worked it out. So rather than doing my top 5 and my personal choice of combiner, I'm going to do a tournament to see who the strongest combiner is. Now in this I've picked 16 combiners and seeded 8 of them. A bit of an open tournament style with standard knockout and rounds involved. With this, a combiner will pair off in a fight, imaginary fight, and we'll work out who the victor will be in each round. And as the combiner progresses and fights another combiner in each round and goes on and so on until we have the final 2. However, it's all going to be part of it, it's all going to be a journey. Their injuries, damages and scars will carry through the tournament along with them. But anyway, that's the rules and this is the duel, let's get on with it. Now here we are with 16 combiners drawn. Now, there are 8 seeded combiners within this. These are the more familiar names that we have seen, such as the likes of Abominus, Superion, Devastator, in order to keep them away from each other, much like in typical tournament fashion. So we'll start off with the first round, which is Predaking and Volcanicus. Now, this is a very mouth-watering tie. Volcanicus, okay, some people don't always believe that he should be a combiner, that he should actually exist, but if there is going to be a draw to Predaking, it's going to be this one. The Dinobots forming their own vicious and strong combiner to tackle the mighty hunter that is Predaking. So as this battle would ensue, there will just be a lot of hand-to-hand combat. There's not really many guns involved in this, despite Predaking's massive shoulder cannons. This is really a mano-a-mano macho combiner fight. As this will go on, Volcanicus would probably show his inexperience on this fight, and Predaking would use a much more of a hunter and a vicious streak to lead and land much striking blows against this. Overall, the victor in this battle would be Predaking. So we come to the next round, and this is Abominus versus Monstructor, and this is a very interesting tie. They're both as unstable as each other. Abominus's main strength is his intimidation. He's quite happy to be the Terracon combiner, and they inspire terror and fear. Not to say that Monstructor doesn't, but the monster bots, if that's what they can be called, Monstructor as a whole is just completely unstable. For those of you who aren't familiar, this was really classed as the first combiner, the first successful combiner in the IDW continuity, which in doing so, in part of the process, which I believe was Jyaxus, actually drove all of the separate limbs and the combiner parts, drove them all insane and mad, and that really is reflected in Monstructor itself. This would be a very close battle, and Monstructor would damage and really leave a mark on Abominus, running it very, very close. But Abominus is the more experienced combiner and actually will come out the victor in this one, but not by much. And on to a bit more of a relatively new combiner. Some of you will know this from the Combiner Wars, Power of the Primes trilogy. We have Optimus Maximus, which of course was Optimus, along with some of his more fellow and sometimes not so fellow Autobot comrades, such as Prowl. And in this, they're going up against Devastator. Now, this is a tall order, to say the least. Many people regard Devastator as the ultimate combiner, a team of 6, one of the longest standing, certainly one of the contenders for being the most individually strongest. But going up against the life of Optimus, and Optimus Maximus, I should say, this would be a taxing battle for Devastator. Optimus would, of course, have to wrestle with the thoughts of his other Autobot comrades inside his head as they try to work out how to defeat Devastator. And this is where the unity side of it really comes into play. Devastator, of course, is the 6 Constructicons. They know how to work together. They've been doing it for long enough. They are the home team and the home unit. Ultimately, this would prove not too taxing for Devastator, and he would emerge victorious. And down at the bottom, we have Leo Kaiser, or Leo Kaiser, depending who you talk to, against Computron. Now, this is, again, a bit of an interesting one in that Leo Kaiser is quite vicious in his way and quite sadistic, quite happy to dissemble and disembark and disengage to pick off the singular combiner foe in the midst of battle and really range the battle from all sides. But Computron will know this is very much about thinking about every strategy in every situation. And as we know, Computron will always make the right decision. But this would leave quite a taxing mark on it, quite an aggressive stance from Leo Kaiser onto Computron would leave its mark. Computron would emerge victorious, but would be severely battled in his fight with Leo Kaiser. And on to the second side of the draw, we have Defensor against Raiden. Now, this is quite an interesting one. We got two Autobot combiners going at it, but Raiden is, again, a new combiner on the block and a 16 combiner. Defensor has been around much longer and is very much the pacifist of the Autobots, encompassing the first aid mentality and not wanting to fight and always looking to protect. Defensor's biggest strength, of course, is his force shield, and he'll use it in this to good effect. Raiden doesn't have all that much to offer and is, again, quite inexperienced in the battle. Ultimately, Defensor will come out victorious on this one. Going down next, we have a familiar face in Superion against the Seacon combiner, Primacon. Now, this is quite interesting as well. The Primacons are almost quite renegade in their way. They are considering themselves, much like most combiners, their loyalty is to their own clan and crew rather to their badge. So the Primacons are quite happy to look out for themselves. And as we know, they are actually a 16 combiner with this rolling mentality of one of them being the gun, the wielded gun, and the rest of them being 5 limbs. It's not so uniform as, say, Superion is. Superion has never been known for being the most strongest defensively. He's quite vulnerable to attacks and will take damage. But again, much like Devastator, has been around for quite some time. So ultimately, Superion would emerge victorious, but would sustain battle along the way. But the ability to fly does often trump the ability to swim. And next we have Menasaur against Victorion. Now, again, for those who don't know, Victorion is a fresh and new construction from the IDW comics. Menasaur will know from many years past. Menasaur does actually have a few tricks up his sleeves. That's not actually a car up his sleeve. He has things like superpowers, sonic waves, occasionally has the ability of flight, depending who you believe, and not always combiners having the ability to fly, and has a big sword and gun to boot. Victorion, however, is again a 16 combiner and is impressively strong. And this would be a very difficult battle for Menasaur because, again, like Superion, Menasaur can be vulnerable, can suffer damage, possibly more so than some of the other combiners, is definitely susceptible to some of Victorion's attacks. And actually, Victorion's sword is much, much bigger. Again, a very tough battle, but I would say Menasaur, through dirty tricks and or shenanigans, dare I say, would emerge victorious on this occasion. And possibly the most one-sided fight here, we have Bruticus against Skyrain. Now, Skyrain, again, was really just thrown in on the IDW comics of Combiner Wars, and it really is Skylinks plus whoever was standing around at the time. Bruticus, this is a well-established combiner. This is a warlord. This is someone who doesn't particularly need a gun and will quite happily just use bare hands and brutish-like tactics. We don't think we need to labour this point. Bruticus comes out the winner. So then moving back up to our first quarter-final, it is Predaking and Abominus. Now, this is a fight I would very much like to see. This is two very aggressive and very intimidating combiners who have fought side by side, particularly in Season 3. But now we have to look at their previous battles. Predaking versus Volcanicus, Abominus versus Monstructor, and who brought the most damage with them, who suffered the biggest damage in their last encounter. Arguably, both of them did. But when it came down to it, I would say Predaking probably sustained the least damage against Volcanicus than, say, Abominus versus Monstructor. Monstructor was a very unpredictable opponent. You could almost say the Dinobots of Volcanicus, their moves could easily be mapped. However, looking at the combiners themselves, Predaking, of course, has the ability of flight, has these two massive shoulder cannons. Abominus, again, uses the intimidation, but Predaking's not having any of it, and he's seen all this before. Again, damage would be done on both sides, but ultimately, Predaking would emerge victorious, but sustaining damage. Then coming down to this side, we have Defensor versus Superion in our other side of it. Now, two Autobots who have fought side by side for many years. This won't be a battle that either of them enjoy doing, but Defensor, again, is the pacifist nature. Superion will have a pacifist side to him, but is probably the more aggressive of the two. Both are fairly evenly matched. Defensor, again, opting for the force shield to protect himself. Superion using the ability of flight to gain the upper hand. There isn't a lot in it, and neither took all that much damage in the previous round. Primacon would actually deal more damage to Superion than, say, Raiden to Defensor. Not a lot in it come the end of it, but Superion would emerge victorious, setting up the semi-final. And then coming down, we have Devastator versus Computron. Now, really, this is again quite one-sided. Devastator did not have that a difficult first round match against Optimus Maximus, where Computron did have the harder round, had against Leo Kaiser, and would be showing the scars. But also, Computron is a much more inexperienced combiner. Whilst they will always come to the right decision, the right outcome, Devastator is kind of bred for war. He will devastate. And Computron doesn't have an awful lot to offer that. Just through sheer brute force alone and the fact that Devastator endured less damage in the previous round, Devastator would emerge victorious. And again, two comrades facing one another, Menasaur against Bruticus. Now, these two haven't stood alongside all that much, but have encountered one another before. But again, the previous round really comes into play here. Victorion was more than a match for Menasaur. Menasaur would certainly be carrying scars, where Bruticus would just be getting warmed up by this point. I don't think any of Menasaur's tricks could really surprise Bruticus. Even with the somewhat dim-wittedness of Bruticus, the art of war is certainly in the Combaticons' favour, and ultimately would set up a very interesting semi-final tie with Bruticus versus Devastator. But before we get to that, we look at our first semi-final, which is Predaking against Superion. Both combiners certainly with the ability of flight, so there's no aerial advantage for one of them. But now the wanes of war and scarring are really starting to show. Predaking coming through Abominus, very hard previous round match, where Superion has had an easier round of it before, but again, is more likely to sustain damage and will show the scars a lot more. Predaking, being the hunter, will focus on that. Again, with neither having the aerial advantage, Predaking will have to use other forms of tactics, such as an arm cannon, which Superion can also do, but Predaking also has a massive sword, which he can wield and cause damage and destruction to. Ultimately, Superion would be too damaged and not have enough firepower to respond. Predaking would advance to the final. And then another heavyweight clash. This really is a giant boxing heavyweight clash. Devastator against Bruticus. Now, this is very interesting because neither have had the hardest draws to get to this point. Devastator has had quite easy first and second rounds. Bruticus had quite an easy first round, probably the easiest of anybody, but not the easiest second round. Nevertheless, these two have fought before. We know this. They know each other. Devastator will rely on presence and firepower. Bruticus will much happily get his hands around Devastator's neck and just cause damage and destruction. The Combaticons are just as unified and just as aligned to causing this level of damage, such as Devastator would be with the Combaticons, with the Constructicons. But ultimately, the victor, not by much, very narrow, would be Bruticus, setting up the final between Predaking and Bruticus. So when it comes to the final, now the path to it really is showing. Both are incredibly strong combiners, possibly the two strongest in their own respective ways. But then you have to look at, well, how did they get there? Bruticus defeating Skyrain, Menasaur, and Devastator as quite an accolade, where Predaking beating Volcanus, Abominus, and Superion is equally as good. They've all tested them in different ways. But ultimately, only one of them can survive. Only one of them can win to be the strongest combiner. Well, the aerial advantage would certainly play into Predaking's favour. So would the firepower element. But again, the brute force, even with Predaking's massive sword, I would say in brute hand-to-hand combat, Bruticus would win out. He is possibly the strongest in hand-to-hand combat, maybe with Devastator being a very close second. Predaking is certainly not weak, certainly got strength behind him, but Bruticus is such a more solid figure, would happily run and tackle and hurt you. Predaking would have to escape to the air more times than he would like, and all it would take is a couple of shots from Bruticus's shoulder cannons to maybe singe Predaking's wings, to cause him crashing down to the floor, and then Bruticus to mount and to wage war. This would be a battle for the ages, a titanic clash, but ultimately there can only be one winner. And there you have it. The winner of the Combiner Wars is Bruticus. He's too strong. He is just an outright brute. Yes, he did have an easier path to the final, but the fact that even back in the Generation 1 cartoon, Optimus and Megatron, albeit for a time, came to the conclusion that Bruticus was too strong to exist and had to go into exile. They were concerned about him then. And even some of these combiners have come later and had their own abilities. And yes, they had their own past and scars along the way. Bruticus would show that he is the strongest combiner of them all. And there we go, that was the King of Combiner Fist tournament to see who the strongest combiner will be. Now of course, your opinions I'm sure will differ, but please leave a note in the comments below as to who you would have liked to have seen progress a little further than perhaps they did, and maybe you're happy with the result, and maybe you believe that Bruticus is the strongest combiner. But that's all for today. Thanks for watching, don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and as always I will see you on the next one.